Horseless Carriage Days by Maxim. Take 2, Chapter 2. The Explosive Bicycle. Once I had decided upon the type of engine I was to use, I could now crowd on all pressure and concentrate on one specific problem, the design of the engine. I knew engines pretty well, but I did not know how much about gasoline. That it was bought in paint shops, that it was about as temperamental as dynamite, was very volatile, would remove grease spots from clothing, and was a petroleum derivative, was about the total of my knowledge. I decided to get a sample and familiarize myself with it. I would find out how best to vaporize it and ignite it, and it would acquire some notion as to how much real kick it would develop when exploded. I visited a paint shop in West Lynn and asked that an 8-ounce bottle be filled. The proprietor looked me over and thought, as though purchasing gasoline were a highly suspicious proceeding. He supplied my wants, but I was to hear from him later about this gasoline business. After 6 o'clock, when the factory had closed, I brought out my little bottle of gasoline and took a fond look at it. It was a colorless, limpid, innocent-appearing liquid. No one would ever suspect it to be loaded with epic-making possibilities. Gazing at the bottle and its fascinating contents, I saw in my mind's eye thousands of drops. Each one of these little drops, vaporized and mixed with air, could develop 10 times the thrust against my bicycle pedals that I could develop with my legs. The contents of that bottle could develop enough power to take me to Salem, if and only if I could provide a cylinder in which to explode it and a piston with the connecting rod and crank to translate the explosions into mechanical motion. It was a fascinating thought. Little did I dream of the years of hard work, study, and discouraging failures which must be gone through with the new materials and devices which must be invented and perfected, the thousands of practical tricks which must be learned, and the hundreds of thousands of dollars which must be spent before a bottle of gasoline could be made to carry a person from Lynn to Salem. Certainly, had I known what lay before me, I would have emptied the bottle in the ash heap. But I did not know. So I pitched in with all the impetuosity of youth. My first experiment was a rough, get-acquainted test. My idea of such a test was to introduce a drop out of the bottle into an empty 6-pounder cartridge case and then touch it off with an ordinary match. A 6-pounder cartridge case is a brass cup some 2 1/2 inches in diameter and some 12 inches deep. I made a wooden stopper which would plug the open end of the cartridge case so that after I had dropped in my gasoline, I could insert the plug, roll the case around a few times, and thus evaporate the gasoline and mix it with air, which should give an explosive mixture. Then I would stand the cartridge case on end on the bench, remove the wooden plug, scratch the match, and toss it into the open end of the case. It was hardly a precise experiment, but it would tell me what I wanted to know. I began with 1 drop. I was excited, for I felt this might be an historic moment for me. Standing back, I scratched the match and tossed it in. There was a very short and very ominous pause. Then the end of the world came, it seemed to me. There was a terrifying explosion. Fire shot up out of the cartridge case, the latter staggering drunkenly on the bench, and the match I had thrown in went hurtling to the ceiling. It was evident that there was about 1,000 times more kick in a drop of gasoline than I had pictured in my wildest flights of imagination. No wonder the old chap who filled my bottle was suspicious. I did not know it at the time, but I had exploded the first of countless millions of gasoline charges that I was destined to explode in succeeding years. I repeated the performance several times, looking for variations which might be significant. Then I tried two drops of gasoline. To my surprise, the result appeared to be about the same. Then I went to 3 drops. Again, I was astonished to find an increased delay between the tossing in of the match and the explosion. And in addition, a less violent explosion. I finally reached a stage where the explosion was quite dull and was accompanied with black smoke. This was my first contact with what we call today a rich mixture. It must be borne in mind that at this time, 1892, there were no spark plugs in the world, no carburetors, no magnetos, no good dry cells, and precious little practical knowledge about explosion engines, not to speak of clutches, change gears, differentials, steering gears, and tires. I even had no definite idea as to where on a vehicle the engine should be placed. Every detail about the automobile which we have today had to be learned in the hard school of experience. I even was not decided as to the principle on which the engine should operate, whether to use the 4-cycle principle of Otto, which gave only 1 power stroke out of 4 strokes of the piston, or the 2-cycle principle of Clerk and others, which gave 1 power stroke out of 2 strokes of the piston. It was difficult to decide. Only 1 power stroke in 4 seemed a sad waste of strokes, although things were thereby made quite definite and certain. The 2-cycle principle seemed to promise twice as much power out of an engine of a given size, but there was a mixing of the fresh gas with the old burned gas and the apparent indefiniteness of everything. After a terrible tussle with myself, I settled upon the 4-cycle principle of Otto. I wince as I record what I settled the size of my cylinders and the stroke and the number of cylinders before I had the least notion of what the engine would have to drive. I can only excuse this on a score of youth. Early in the spring of 1893, on another one of my visits to Salem, I happened upon a second-hand Columbia tandem tricycle. It had seen better days, but it was complete and could be purchased for $30. The forward wheel was ridiculously small and had a badly worn solid rubber tire about 1/2 inch in diameter. The 2 rear wheels had 1-inch solid rubber tires. Today, they would look grotesquely thin, but in those days, the present pneumatic tire would have looked grotesquely fat. This machine fascinated me. It would not fall over. It was large and provided what seemed to me ample room for an engine. And what was immensely appealing, there was that extra seat which some day might perhaps be occupied by a certain somebody. I hovered about that tricycle for weeks. $30 was a lot of money, and any purchase of that magnitude must not be entered upon lightly. But at last, ambition and romance conquered, and I decided to buy it. I induced my assistant in the factory, the late Leonard Stone, to go over to Salem with me on the train and ride the tricycle back to Lynn. He had no notion in the world what was brewing and regarded the entire proceeding as queer. When I finally led him into the bicycle shop in Salem and he took his first look at the machine that I had purchased, his eyes almost popped out of his head, but he was a good sort, and amid much attention from the bystanders, we maneuvered the thing to the street and mounted. Both of us were bicycle riders. Neither of us had ever been on a tricycle. This particular tricycle had somehow acquired a list to starboard. Being bicycle riders, we could not help steering in the direction in which we thought we were falling. It was one of those involuntary acts that cannot be overcome except by the most intense mental effort and an abiding faith. In the first 20 feet, we ran hard up against the curb. No power on earth could keep us away from that curb. The street was considerably crowded, and this, added to the list to starboard, made it physically impossible for us to steer anywhere but to the right. We dismounted and examined the steering mechanism. Both of us were convinced it was entirely out of fix, but we found it was perfectly free, there being no reason why the thing should not steer. We trundled it out into the street and started over again. In spite of our best efforts, both of us leaning away over to port, we could not prevent again pulling into the curb. The hangers-on at the bicycle shop became interested in us at this point. They shouted all manner of advice. The proprietor came out and in a disapproving manner explained to us that the tricycle was different from a bicycle. It would not tip over. We must forget the balancing idea and sit on the saddle and push regardless of whether the machine seemed on the point of capsizing. We would find that we could steer is where we wanted. Steer it where we wanted. So we started once more, this time with a fierce determination to divorce the balancing from the steering. It worked, albeit both of us could not refrain from leaning away out to one side. I remember that I estimated I was pushing on the pedals with at least 20 times the power needed on my bicycle. Every few yards we had to apply a strong mental resolve to steer to the left, notwithstanding the machine leaned ominously to the right. After proceeding about a mile, we were both completely exhausted. We stopped, and I recall the queer sensation of remaining seated without the machine falling over. It was a long pull to Lynn. On the way, I profoundly altered my ideas as to the amount of power which an engine would need to propel this vehicle up a sharp grade. The presence of this tricycle in a vacant room next to my office in the factory was a constant incentive to hurry. There it stood, ready to take the road. All I needed was an engine to drive it. Everything had to be done after 6 o'clock at night or on Sundays and holidays, because during the day my job had to have my attention. This slowed progress, but there was nothing that could be done about it. The magnitude of my problem began to dawn upon me about a month after the tandem tricycle was purchased. I worked nearly every night until midnight, and alone in that silent factory, I strove mightily at first to design the general layout, the chain drive, the clutch, its operating mechanism, a change gear system, gasoline tank, and support engine mounting and engine. But every effort resulted in something that required an express wagon to contain it. And I had to have it on a little tricycle. Discouraged, but by no means dissuaded, I fell into the error that so many engineers fall into. I decided to design and build my engine and then find a way to mount it in the tricycle. I had not learned that if I could not manage the design of the general layout with pencil and paper, when things can be changed and shifted by the simple manipulation of a rubber eraser, I never would be successful with an engine and a tricycle that were already built. The designing of an engine was easy, or so I thought. I laid out a light 3-cylinder 4-cycle air-cooled machine, 3 inches bore by 3 inches stroke with mechanically actuated exhaust and automatic inlet valves. I decided upon make and break low tension ignition because it seemed simpler and more reliable. I passed up the carbureting arrangement, muffler, manifolds, and lubricating systems as minor details, the designing of which could be tossed off at any convenient time. Another horrible example of how not to proceed. It required months of night work to finish the engine design and make all the working drawings. It took months more to get the patterns, castings, and machine work done here and there and everywhere. Some of the work was done at the factory by a man I hired and paid. I was staggered at the amount of time required to build one small engine. Late in 1894, it was finished. A beautiful piece of work had been done. I thought it the most ravishing, beautiful bit of machinery the hand of man had ever created. The satisfaction of at last possessing an engine was, however, short-lived. It needed a supply of gas, and it needed an electric spark, not to speak of something to fasten to. I had ideas about all three, but they were a bit nebulous. It had yet to be borne in upon me that one kind of a mixture would ignite easily in a cold engine, quite a different one in a hot engine, and that the spark had to be advanced considerably ahead of the top of the compression stroke. In fact, there was a very long list of things which had to be borne in upon me before the engine was to drive that tricycle. I set my little darling up on a frame where I could crank it. Then I tackled the carburetor question. After much reading and thinking, I took a small kerosene can, the kind with a curved spout, soldered a copper tube in the bottom, and led this to a needle valve. The needle valve was located at the end of the inlet manifold. When I opened the needle valve, gasoline dripped. When the engine sucked, the gasoline which was passing was drawn in. When the engine was not sucking, the gasoline ran down on the floor. This was simple and direct, even if today it sounds inefficient and dangerous. I freely grant it was both. As might be expected, I had trouble starting my new engine. The whole future looks black and forbidding after spending a week unsuccessfully cranking a cold gasoline engine. I used up a prodigious quantity of gasoline. Most of it dripped onto the floor and was wasted. In fact, all of it was wasted for a long time. The engine certainly did not consume any in running. I was compelled to return to the paint shop frequently to have the 8-ounce bottle refilled. Some days I went twice. After a fortnight of this sort of thing, the old gentleman who ran the paint shop became suspicious. From the beginning, he had acted as though he supplied my gasoline demands under protest. When things reached the pass where I was in every day for 8 ounces of gasoline, and sometimes twice in the same day, he became alarmed, intently regarding me over the tops of his glasses. One day, and holding my empty 8-ounce bottle in a threatening way, he asked, "What are you doing with all this gasoline?" It is interesting to note that I was ashamed to tell him that I was developing a gasoline engine for a road vehicle. I feared he might have me arrested. I dodged and replied that I was carrying on some experiments. West Lynn was the home of the Thomas Houston Company, and from Professor Thomas down, nearly everybody was experimenting. The old gentleman asked me if I connected with the Thompson Houston Company. I was not, so I had to tell him so. For a moment I considered explaining to this hard-shelled Yankee that I was doing with the gasoline, but I thought better of it. I would be explaining for the rest of the day. The old chap realized it was not my desire to convey any further information, and as it was his business to purvey gasoline, among other commodities, he saw he must fill my 8-ounce bottle as often as I was willing and able to pay for it. But he disapproved of any young man consuming such quantities as I consumed. So, by way of relieving himself of what he probably considered his moral responsibilities, he announced, "Well now, young feller, let me tell you something you probably don't know. Everybody who ever experimented with gasoline got killed doing it. Not a one of them alive today. I'm just warning you of your, that's all." I could think of no reply that would meet the situation, so I did what every young person always does under these circumstances. I passed the situation off with a nervous laugh. Just the same, visions of that gasoline-soaked wooden floor, that exquisite little nickel-plated engine, the factory itself, a chance spark, all floated across my mind. On the way back to the factory, with my 8-ounce bottle of gasoline in my hand, I decided to catch that dripping gasoline and thereby not only reduce the fire hazard, but reduce gasoline consumption and the frequency of my trips to the paint shop. In the 40-odd years that have passed since the colloquy in the paint shop, I have many times reflected upon what that old fellow typified. Had I taken him into any confidence back there in 1893 and explained to him that conditions were ripe for a gasoline engine-propelled road vehicle, that I was likely to be among the first to have one running, and that I believed it would become a big industry, he would have branded me as a person whose sanity was askew. He would have been backed up by every solid businessman. And yet it so happened that I was right, and all the solid businessmen would have been wrong. Since that day, I have been identified with several other new industries, and I have found that the solid businessman of recent years is an entirely different sort of being from his prototype of 40 years ago. Today, anything is believed possible. So much money has been made from startling new things that the most revolutionary idea is given serious consideration. That odd codger in the paint shop 40-odd years ago went to his grave never dreaming that a great new industry had touched him when I took my 8-ounce bottle in and asked to have it filled with gasoline. Returning to the beautiful creation that seemed perfect in all particulars except its prime objective, everyone experienced in experimenting with a gasoline engine knows that the reason my little engine would not start was because of spark or gas trouble. After a fortnight of exhausting and unsuccessful cranking, I arrived at this conclusion. There was no way to look in and see if the igniter sparked, and I decided upon an indirect way of proving the spark. It was nothing short of heroic. It was to put in enough juice to draw a respectable arc at the igniters. This would burn the igniter points. If burning were disclosed after a few hours cranking, it was conclusive evidence that the spark was sparking. And so it came about that I coupled my spark coil and my igniters up to the direct current electric light system in the factory. Being young and inexperienced in research work, I yielded to temptation and made more than one change at a time. From the condition of my right arm, it seemed to me wise to mount the little engine in a lathe, where the shop power could be used to crank it. This shocked my friend, Stone, who by this time was keenly interested in the mystery of why my motor so steadfastly refused to moat. He argued that if it were necessary for a self-propelled road vehicle to carry around an entire factory lighting system and a lathe and the power to run the lathe, did it not appear that the thing would become a bit top-heavy? My reply was that this was research work, and the expedients adopted to establish certain basic facts did not represent what would be used in actual practice. But Stone was skeptical, and yearned for a steam boiler, a few chunks of coal, some water, and a steam engine. Said he, if there's water in the boiler and a fire under the boiler and the boiler doesn't burst, then it's a cinch that the engine has got to run. But something told me that steam would not do. One more change was made to further add to the confusion. Instead of letting the gasoline drip across the inlet pipe, I rigged a little box in which I arranged some rags. The gasoline dripped upon these rags and kept them saturated. The amount of saturation was to be controlled by the needle valve. One afternoon, just before quitting time, everything was set up in a lathe in the tool room. By this time, the whole factory had become interested in the game of getting the pretty little engine to run. Stone stood beside me when I grasped the shipper, which is the wooden lever that stops and starts the lathe. A bit concerned over the outcome, since matters had assumed large-scale proportions and I was dealing with big powers, not to speak of having the entire tool room personnel as an audience, I very gingerly pulled the shipper over. Amid the unusual belt squeaking, the lathe began to turn, and with it the engine. I opened the needle valve, and the gasoline dripped on the rags. If she was going to moat, now was the time. Half a minute passed with no results. The smell of gasoline pervaded the entire tool room. This told me that the real good gas must be going through the engine. I had not had experience enough to know that I had a frightfully rich mixture, although my experiments with the 6-pounder cartridge case ought to have shown me. After what seemed a long time, I thought it the better part of wisdom to shut off the power and look the thing over. My first desire was to have a look at the igniter points to see if they showed any signs of burning. All 3 were taken apart, and all showed most unmistakable evidence of pronounced burning. Evidently, they had been sparking. They certainly should have been. What possibly could be the trouble? A real healthy spark, all kinds of gas, and yet not one single explosion. I began to suspect the mixture and to try it. I decided to run the engine with the needle valve closed and gasoline dripping. When the rags had become dry, I would slowly open the needle valve and thus gradually richen the mixture from pure air to maximum richness. Stone concurred in this and urged prompt action. As his train left on the Sagas branch just back of the shop at 6:15, and it was then 5:45. With the gasoline shut off, but the rags still wet, I pulled the shipper over again. The lathe turned a few times when, without the slightest warning, what seemed like the most frightful machine gun fire cut loose. I had never heard such a terrible clatter. Noise came from everywhere. Something was buzzing around under my nose at tremendous speed. Fire was spitting out of everything, and smoke, smell, and confusion reigned supreme. We had no warning at all. Hell just broke loose, and there we were, right in the middle of it. Stone leapt for the door and paused in the doorway to cast a horrified look back to estimate the damage. Every tool maker scrambled to a position that suggested preparations for dodging flying missiles. Not a one of them ever had heard such an astonishing noise. I gave an awful jump, and by either accident or intent, threw the shipper back and shut off the power. Instantly quiet fell. It came as suddenly and as unexpectedly as the noise. Blue smoke filled the room and curled out of the exhaust pipes of the little engine. My engine had run. But how differently from the way I had imagined it would. I had pictured in my mind a sweet-running little sewing machine effect, whirring around, just hungering to be harnessed to the tricycle. Okay. Instead, here was the most savage, impetuous, noisy, and riotous little spitfire that the mind of man could conceive. There was some tall thinking done that evening. I had my first real disillusionment. The nature and general temperament of the gasoline engine was not at all what I had pictured it. This larger aspect of things dwarfed the small question of what finally made it start. I was hit pretty hard, having no previous experience in a field where most of the fundamentals were new and unknown. I found things looking pretty foggy. I have to confess that I was afraid of the little engine too, for it had given me a very bad fright. If it was going to go off like a bunch of cannon crackers every time I started it, there was not so much fun in fooling with it. But time straightened out a lot of the confusion, and after a few days I began to cheer up. The noise and fire spitting could be handled in a muffler. The ignition probably had been all right from the beginning. I would not need the factory lighting system. The trouble all along had been with the mixture. The rag carburetor would not do it all. It offered too much hangover effect. I would have to make a mixture control valve that would give me positive control of air and gas. And that's it for today.